Okay, starting on page 92 where I left off. Nevertheless, in determining that the officer's actions conform to departmental guidelines, the supervisor justifying this use of force wrote, "The X-26 taser fills the action void with a force less than either epitome or deadly force to elicit compliance from individuals who are about to be arrested. It allows members to use a relative mild force and provides a safer option than suffering or inflicting serious injury." The supervisor's determination that dry stunning a restrained mentally ill person is mild and justified because it prevents suffering or serious injury illustrates a lack of appreciation for the seriousness of the force used and the possibility of harm that could result. See Brian V. McPherson, 2010. The psychological effects, the high levels of pain and foreseeable risk of physical injury led us to conclude that the X-26 and similar tasers are a greater intrusion than other non-lethal methods of force we have confronted. It also demonstrates an ignorance of applicable Fourth Circuit law that prohibits the use of a taser in these circumstances. In a strikingly similar 2014 incident, a BPD officer responded to a domestic violence call, took the subject into custody, and transported him to the district station. When officers ordered Eric to exit the transport wagon, he refused and stated, "I want the police to shoot me. I have nothing to live for." The officers warned Eric several times that he would be tased, but when he refused to comply with their commands, the sergeant on the scene ordered one of the officers to tase Eric. The taser probe struck Eric in the arm and the buttocks. Subsequently, the officers transported Eric to the hospital for an emergency petition. This use of force on a passively non-compliant person in crisis was unreasonable. The officers resorted to force simply to gain compliance from Eric, not because they needed to gain control over him. In doing so, BPD officers disregarded an individual's constitutional rights in favor of expediency. The sergeant who ordered the officer to tase Eric and also investigated the use of force despite the conflict of interest justified the taser deployment by signing what appeared to be a version of the department's training guidelines titled Electronic Shock Devices that had been replaced in 2010, 4 years before the incident took place. BPD uses unreasonable force against persons who are fleeing from them and present little or no threat of harm. A significant number of incidents we reviewed involved BPD officers using force against individuals who were fleeing from officers and presented little or no threat of harm to them or others. Many of these incidents involved officers who chased civilians on foot, often without suspicion that they had committed any serious crime. Such foot pursuits increase the likelihood that officers will use force in order to stop an individual that is not reasonable in light of the threat posed or crime committed by the person. Foot pursuits of individuals for low-level offenses are also an unsafe tactic that unnecessarily endangers officers and community members. Similarly, we found a number of cases in which officers shot at vehicles that were fleeing or moving away from them after any threat of harm to them or others had subsided. Such shootings are unreasonable, such as the one that occurred in Chicago. In foot pursuits, BPD uses excessive force against individuals who are fleeing from them and tactics that endanger themselves and community members. BPD officers use excessive force against individuals during foot pursuits. When officers encounter civilians who flee from them, officers nearly always gave chase without weighing the severity of any suspected crime, whether the person poses a threat or any alternative, safer means to effect a stop or seizure. Once engaged in a foot pursuit, BPD officers then often use force to end the pursuit regardless of whether they had any reasonable suspicion to conduct a stop or probable cause to make an arrest. When an officer's use of force during such a Terry stop becomes so disproportionate to the purpose of such a stop in light of the surrounding circumstances, and the purpose may include ensuring the safety of the officers or others, then the encounter becomes a formal arrest, which must then be justified by probable cause. Citations were omitted. Often the force officers used to end the pursuit was disproportional to the suspected crime and the threat posed by the civilian. To properly consider the reasonableness of the force employed, we must view it in full context with an eye towards the proportionality of the force in light of all the circumstances. Based on the force reports we reviewed, the frequency with which officers engage in foot pursuits without considering the seriousness of the suspected crime, any alternative means to stop the individual, and risk to themselves, the suspect, and others is concerning. Foot pursuits are generally a high-risk tactic and have civil rights implications. See generally IACP, Protecting Civil Rights, a leadership guide for state, local, and tribal law enforcement, page 133. In particular, at the end of a foot pursuit, when officers seize an individual, they may experience an adrenaline rush. Actions taken under such circumstances may impede an officer's ability to exercise proper judgment and appropriate restraint. For this reason, police departments should and generally do give careful consideration to foot pursuits in policy and training. BPD has not engaged in the careful consideration that foot pursuits require as a policy and training matter. BPD has no policy on foot pursuits to guide and hold accountable its officers' conduct. An internal report in 2013 recommended that the department issue a policy on these pursuits, and its internal documents indicate that it has intended to draft a policy to guide officers' conduct in pursuits for a number of years. However, to date, BPD has not issued any policy on this issue. BPD's training on foot pursuits for both new and experienced officers also is deficient. Only in 2015 did BPD create a specific training on foot pursuits for its recruits in the academy. Previously, its training on this tactic was spread throughout several different courses, leaving it to officers to tie the lessons together. Additionally, the skills that officers learn in the academy must be refreshed frequently throughout the officer's career through in-service training. For experienced officers, BPD provided in-service training on foot pursuits for the first time in 2015. BPD officers resort to excessive force to end foot pursuits or after a pursuit has occurred. For example, in the 2010 incident discussed on page 31, an officer reportedly in an area known for violent crime and narcotics distribution recognized an African-American man who had previously fled when the officer had attempted to conduct a field interview and again fled at the sight of the officer. The officer reportedly pursued the man because he believed he was involved in criminal activity, though he did not identify any specific crime he suspected. He also reportedly believed he may be armed with a concealed weapon because of his actions, loose clothing, and the surroundings. This sounds like Freddie Gray. Such generic and vague descriptions are insufficient to justify using serious force against the person. Here, the officer pursued the man on foot for 8 blocks. During the pursuit, the officer deployed his taser in probe mode 2 times on the man and then finally used a drive stun to stop the individual. The officer then frisked the man and found he was not carrying any firearms. To strike the man with 2 deployments of a taser in probe mode and 1 in drive stun was excessive in these circumstances. A lieutenant who arrived on the scene interviewed the man and asked why he had run from the officer. The man informed the lieutenant that he was scared. Officers released the man without charging him for any crime, but he got tased 3 times. Separate from the risk of excessive force, BPD officers also use unsafe tactics when they engage in foot pursuits, needlessly endangering themselves and community members. The risk of engaging in a foot pursuit may outweigh the benefits in a number of cases. Particularly when officers are acting alone, pursuits are not advised. Indeed, the IACP has also cautioned that normally, conducting a foot pursuit alone is far too dangerous an undertaking to be permissible. In our review of BPD's files, officers engage in solo foot pursuits frequently, even when in some cases they believe the person they are pursuing to be armed. Engaging in a solo pursuit of an armed person is dangerous to the officer and may make it more likely that shots may be fired, increasing the danger to community members. BPD officers repeatedly fail to consider the risk factors inherent in foot pursuits. They too frequently employ tactics that are unsafe for officers, the individuals they pursue, and the community. When officers decide to pursue a suspect, even though they must decide quickly whether to pursue, they should assess the seriousness of the suspected violation at issue, the dangerousness of the pursuit under the circumstances, whether the person they intend to pursue poses an immediate and serious threat or could be apprehended later or through other means. The need for the suspect's immediate apprehension must be weighed against the risk to officers and the public caused by engaging in a foot pursuit. If officers know the identity of the suspect, his or her immediate apprehension is likely unnecessary without extringent circumstances. However, if circumstances require that the subject be immediately apprehended, officers should contain the suspect and establish a perimeter rather than engaging in a foot pursuit, particularly if officers believe the suspect may be armed. Officers may then conduct a sweep in a coordinated manner within the contained area to locate the suspect with the assistance of surveillance if this is available. This recognizes that the safety of the officers and community members is paramount when alternative tactics are available to resolve the incident. Containing a suspect and establishing a perimeter also slows the incident down, decreases the need for rushed decisions or judgments made in adrenaline-filled circumstances, and decreases the need to use force to apprehend a suspect. Officers should be encouraged and incentivized to choose safe and professional courses of conduct. Indeed, the IACP recommends that because of the inherent and demonstrated dangers involved in foot pursuits, it should be a matter of agency policy that officers should not be criticized or sanctioned for making a rational and professionally informed decision not to engage in or to terminate a foot pursuit. BPD, to the contrary, indirectly encourages foot pursuits by placing a heavy emphasis on officers' arrest numbers. As discussed above in Section 2A, Portion 1, some supervisors still assess officers, at least in part, by the number of arrests they make, regardless of the severity of the underlying crime. This incentivizes officers to pursue individuals for even minor infractions to increase the number of arrests they make. Additionally, pressure from past city officials to lower the rate of violent crime also has encouraged officers to pursue and seize individuals who may be armed in an attempt to seize and remove their guns from the street. This is a high-risk strategy that, if engaged in, must have strict controls and oversight to ensure that officers' actions are constitutional and that officers and the public are not exposed to unnecessary risks. Our investigation finds that such controls and oversights are not present and that officers do not appear to be engaging in pursuits of individuals who they suspect are armed in a manner that keeps them and others safe. For example, in a 2014 incident, a uniformed officer patrolling in an area allegedly known for drug trafficking and violence turned on his lights and sirens to respond to a call for service regarding a silent alarm on a nearby block. As he did so, he noticed Andrew, an unknown black male, observe his marked uniform presence and fled on foot. The officer noted that Andrew was holding his left side, which the officer believed to be a characteristic of an armed person. The officer abandoned the call for service that he had been responding to and instead pursued Andrew, an unknown individual, alone on foot. Andrew entered a residential home from the back porch and locked the door behind him. The officer, believing that he might be armed and fearing that the house he entered might not have been his, and also fearing that any evidence or contraband weapons he might have on him would be destroyed, concealed, forced entry into the house, damaging the door in the process. If Andrew had been armed, the officer's choice of tactics, forcing entry without backup, could have resulted in the officer being shot. Andrew ran to the front door where the officer caught up to him and attempted to make an arrest. The officer did not specify the crime for which he was attempting to make the arrest. While the two were struggling at the front door, a pit bull charged at them from inside the house. The officer withdrew his service weapon, fearing that he would have to shoot the dog. Eventually, to avoid the dog, the officer let Andrew run out the front door and continued to pursue on foot. The officer then decided to tase Andrew because he believed Andrew was involved in illegal activity, suspecting he had entered an unknown house, might be armed, and had already resisted all attempts to apprehend him. The officer tased Andrew 2 times as the first deployment was not effective. After taking him into custody, the officer discovered that Andrew was not armed, had no contraband, and was eventually determined at a later unknown time to have an open warrant. The reason for the officer's force listed in his use of force report was that the suspect refused to comply. This officer repeatedly used unsafe tactics that endangered himself, the individual he pursued, and a homeowner, and damaged a homeowner's property. He chose to engage in a foot pursuit in an alleged violent area while believing the person he was pursuing to be armed. There is no indication in the report that he called for backup or considered discontinuing the pursuit at any time. He forced entry into an unknown home where the person he was pursuing was inside and at a tactical advantage to the officer. If Andrew had actually been armed, as the officer suspected he was, the officer could have been shot. The officer damaged the home by breaking the door, potentially increasing the danger to the homeowner he was trying to protect, and pointing his firearm at the homeowner's dog while struggling with a man, creating a risk of harm to the homeowner's property. The officer's use of force against Andrew was highly questionable, if not clearly unreasonable, particularly given the officer's own training on the likelihood that the individual was armed. Like the officers in the above accounts, officers frequently cite factors learned in BPD's training on characteristics of an armed person, such as grabbing one's waistband or wearing loose clothing. Yeah, really. Officers appear to use these factors to justify the force they use during or following pursuits, asserting that they believe individuals who exhibit any one of these factors to be armed. BPD provides their training on characteristics of an armed person to teach officers to identify when a person may be armed, which may provide reasonable suspicion for a stop. BPD training instructors warned students that there may be false positives and informed us that they instruct students that 80% of individuals who show characteristics of an armed person, such as wearing loose or baggy clothing or grabbing their waistbands while running, will not be armed. Despite purportedly being trained on false positives, BPD officers nevertheless frequently engage in foot pursuits and use force on individuals based solely on factors such as wearing loose clothing. We found that this results at times in the use of excessive force. Some of the incidents reviewed involved officers shooting at individuals who were fleeing from them and who officers suspected were armed. In a number of cases involving BPD officers' uses of deadly force, it was not clear that the individual officer shot at had actually threatened the officer or others with serious or deadly harm. Without an immediate threat, simply being in possession of a firearm does not justify using deadly force. Tennessee v. Garner, 1985, Cooper v. Sheehan, 2013. The mere possession of a firearm by a suspect is not enough to permit the use of deadly force. Anybody remember what happened in Baton Rouge? Thus, an officer does not possess the unfettered authority to shoot a member of the public simply because that person is carrying a weapon. Instead, deadly force may only be used by a police officer when, based on a reasonable assessment, the officer or another person is threatened with the weapon. However, because the investigations of these incidents were so incomplete as further explained below in Section 2, it is difficult to determine based on the information provided in BPD's investigative files whether officers faced any immediate threat before firing. For example, in a 2013 case, 4 officers traveling in 2 unmarked vehicles pursued a suspect after they heard gunshots. The suspect allegedly raised a firearm while running, then ran through the yard of a residence, though the officers' statements regarding the suspect's actions were inconsistent. The officers parked their vehicle and gave chase on foot. At some point during the foot pursuit, the suspect may have tossed his gun. One witnessing officer stated in his interview that the suspect tossed his gun when he jumped on a bush before the officer heard the next gunshot, which struck the suspect. When asked whether the potential gun toss occurred before or after he was shot, he stated he had not seen the actual gun toss. Another officer found a gun near a bush several feet from where the suspect lay after being shot.